Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Leah. I'm the Knowledge Exchange Coordinator here at Women's Shelters Canada. I'm just going to go through a few quick housekeeping reminders, and then I will hand it over to my colleague to introduce the topic, our panelists, and get us started. So just one final reminder about the interpretation. If you're listening in English today, you don't need to do anything. If you are listening in French, you can activate the interpretation at the bottom of your screen. Vous pouvez cliquer sur le bouton Interprétation en dessous de votre écran et sélectionner Français. And I'll put that in a chat in just a moment. If you have any technical issues with that throughout our session today, please feel free to send me a message in the chat and I will do my best to work with you to fix it. And on that note, you've probably noticed your video and audio are off. Only our panelists today will be able to have their video and audio on. It's just to make sure we have really clear audio for everyone today. We have more than 40, 50 people here, so we want to make sure things stay clear. But we do want to hear from you. It doesn't mean we don't want your participation. You can see down at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat box and a Q&A. So if you have a comment you want to make, if you want to say hi, you can use that chat box if you have a technical question for that kind of thing. If you have a question for our panelists, I invite you to put that in the Q&A box. That will allow us to keep track of your questions, to see them in one place, and we'll be able to get to as many of them as possible that way. Sorry, always at the beginning of a webinar. Yeah, so don't hesitate to reach out to us in the chat or the Q&A throughout. And just a reminder, we are recording today's webinar and we will be sharing a recording of it afterwards. So without further ado, I want to pass things over to my colleague here at Women's Shelters Canada, Brittany Scarrett, who will be moderating today's discussion. So she'll give more of an intro. So Britt, over to you.
Thank you, Leah. Hello, and thank you so much for joining us. As Leah mentioned, I'm Brittany Scarrett. I am the Development and Communications Coordinator at Women's Shelters Canada, and I'm so happy to be monitoring this event for everyone. I do want to start with a land acknowledgement and let you know that I'm joining you today from the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I know there are a lot of people joining us today from all across Turtle Island, so please feel free to let us know where you're joining us from in the chat below. If you don't know what territory you are on, I also encourage you to find out and to learn more about the history and current context of the land you are on and the impacts of the ongoing settler colonialism on that land and its people. Especially the history and impact of residential schools, given the recent news. I also wanted to have a moment of silence for the 215 murdered children found in Kamloops and the many more across Canada. So I think for maybe about like 10, 20 seconds, if we could have a moment of silence, that would be great. All right, thank you all so much. I'm going to start with also a brief overview of what we're going to be discussing today. So 2020 was a bleak reminder of the systematic racism in Canada and around the world. After the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, the suspicious death of Regis Korchinski-Plack in Toronto, the Black Lives Matter movement, and many more other atrocities regarding racism worldwide, we saw a resurgence of diversity and inclusion efforts across most organizations and institutions. Many women's shelters and transition houses rushed to voice their support for the Black Lives Matter movement and train their staff to be more inclusive. But with acting so quickly, were opportunities missed to discuss more long-term sustainable change? Has the diversity and inclusion work done so far been effective? And are we seeing cases of performative activism as we're going through this process? So in the webinar today, we want to explore what work needs to be done outside of a diversity and inclusion curriculum and how we can change our approach to a more anti-racist, anti-oppressive workplace. As the moderator of this discussion, I would like to invite everyone to be kind, to keep an open mind, and to note that this is a safe place for a constructive and reflective discussion about a sensitive topic. So to help explore this, I have Hawa Dumbuya-Sesay, the Executive Director of YWCA Northwest Territories, and Carla Neto, Community Programs Manager of Women's Habitat of Etobicoke, joining me. As women of color and leaders in our field, they have firsthand experience of how workplaces can support people of color, as well as what challenges we are facing in this current climate. I will have a couple of questions that I'm going to ask Carla and Hawa, but we'll hold for about 15 minutes for questions from everyone at the end. And I'll be sure to remind you all as well. So be sure to put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But before we go into everything, I also have a poll for everyone, just to see where everyone is at when it comes to like diversity inclusion in your workplace and all of that. I'm curious to know. So the first question being, has your workplace taken formal steps to be more inclusive in the last 2 years? And do you feel like there has been constructive changes in your workplace? So please take a few seconds to respond so we can kind of get a sense of how are things going in the sector from your perspective. And also your responses are completely anonymous, so don't worry about that. And Leah, sorry, I'm not able to see the poll. So let me know when we're good to go.
Okay, yeah, it looks like most people have responded here. So why don't I close that poll and share those results? So it looks like, sorry, I'm not sure if you can see it, Britt, so I'll just say it out loud here. It looks like about 50% of folks, their workplaces have taken formal steps over the past few years. 38% said somewhat, a few said no, or they're not sure. When it gets to the second question, most people said somewhat. Some constructive changes have been made, so the numbers are a little lower there. 60%, or sorry, about 50% said somewhat, 30% said yes, and 20% said no. So back to you, Britt.
Awesome. Yeah, that seems like great feedback to know that we think somewhat of what has been done when it comes to diversity inclusion has been constructive. So hopefully as we go through the questions and as we talk to Carla and Hawa, then we can kind of get a better perspective of what needs to change or how to change your perspective as well. So I will jump right into the questions. I think I'm going to start with Hawa, if you're okay with that. The first question I have for you is, what are your suggestions for creating constructive changes around diversity, inclusion, and anti-oppression work in VAW shelters?
Thank you, Brittany. I think for me, over the years, working at the shelter and working with people from diverse background, I think in terms of looking at what needs to change, we always need to start with the self. You always have to look at yourself and really take an honest look, not just kind of just doing it to please people, but take an honest look at yourself and say, what are some opinions, what are some values, what are some beliefs that I have that are really detrimental to achieving diversity and inclusion in my workplace, in my personal life, in my home, right? Because we have to start looking at all aspects of our life using a holistic approach, not just when I go to work, I have to be like this because this is required at work, but it's something that we have to truly believe in and embrace those differences. So we start with ourselves. And And I think as leaders in those organizations or in your household, we need to start holding people accountable. So if you're at work and you observe anything that's anti-oppressive towards someone that is not able to speak up, or sometimes the person may not recognize it as that, like you need to speak up, you need to stand up. And I think it's just about us taking those steps and identifying what our own biases are and what we see around us, and then start changing things from there. So in terms of constructive changes is recognizing the differences we have within our workplaces and embracing those differences and being open to them as well. Not just accepting because you have to, because it's a workplace, you have to do stuff, but it's also about just being willing and open to learning and sharing and embracing others. Thank you.
For sure, that's great, Hawa. Thank you so much. I definitely feel you when you say it starts with the self. That's so important. And same question for you, Carla. I would love to know your suggestions for creating a more constructive changes around D&I in the workplace.
Well, thank you. Thank you. First of all, thank you so very much for creating this platform for Hawa and myself to share our thoughts. I was absolutely going to be answering this question. It's a twofold answer. And the first one goes very much with what Hawa has said around starting with self. This work that we do is so complex and we bring ourselves to work. And so when Hawa says you need to examine our values and our beliefs, that is very important. And it's important because when we look at ideology, which is really what fuels oppression, what's in ideology? Values, beliefs, right? Which kind of get normalized, right? The ideology that is behind oppression, or the different ideologies that are behind oppression, very much have to do with the dominant ideology, right? So you need to figure out, what are my values? What are my beliefs? When did I adopt those values, right? Do I still hold them dear? Are my personal values in line with the organization's values, for example, right? So before we jump on writing policy, going on training and, forcing our staff to do these trainings, these are the things that we need to be thinking about, starting with self. This work is very complex. Like I said, self-reflection and checking our biases are critical for the work. So when it comes to anti-oppression work, it needs to start at all levels of the organization. You cannot think that if you put on this, training, or if you write a policy, that all of a sudden folks are going to be behaving unoppressively. So you need to be looking from the top to the bottom across the organization. What are the areas that you need to ensure that anti-oppression behaviors and philosophies are embedded? And I would look at leadership and governance. I would look at organizational culture, right? What's your vision? What's the mission? What are the beliefs and commitments of the organization, right? How do you design your programs, right? Service delivery, what does it look like? What is the eligibility criteria? What are the barriers? In terms of systems and operations, you're looking at, who do you hire under your hiring practices, right? What are some of the policies that you have? How are the resources distributed across the organization, right? Because all of these really have an impact in the interpersonal dynamics. How you treat your staff, how you treat your colleagues have much to do with where you are as a person, where the organization is at in terms of structure, in terms of the culture. And that's what I'm going to say for this question.
That was great. Thank you so much. And also to the both of you, if either of you ever want to respond to the other panelists, please feel free to interject. But yeah, I completely agree with you. Like having your values across, like displayed across the board from the top to the bottom, to your policies, to your programming, is so important, and at the heart of what kind of will make a difference when it comes to diversity and inclusion. Yeah, so thank you so much for your answers there. The second question that I have for you all is that you both are coming from very different locations across Canada, one in Toronto and one in Yellowknife. And there are people in the audience from all across the country as well. So does the approach to diversity and inclusion need to look different from different communities or for different communities? And can you tell us a bit about what anti-oppression conversations look like in your specific communities? And I will start with Carla on this.
Okay, and Mari is asking where we're working. I work at Women's Habitat of Etobicoke, Mari. Okay, so this is another complex question. So in Toronto, we consider Toronto to be the big melting pot where the world meets. Well, certainly Toronto's population is very diverse in terms of culture and ethnicity, right? But it's important for us to first ask ourselves, when we talk about diversity, what dimensions of diversity are we talking about? Are we talking about gender? Are we talking about class, religion, age, etc.? It's also important to think about that even though some people may come from similar backgrounds, right? And they may have similar experiences, they're not the same, right? They're not the same. And we do that so that we don't leave room for assumptions and for stereotypes, right? We need to make sure that we account for people's differences in perspectives and experiences and so on. So again, I start with examining what diversity means to you, to your organization. You know, what do you mean by diverse? I think you need to be very clear. Are we talking about racial diversity? Are we talking about gender identity? What are we talking about, right? And even if we manage to have a level of diversity in our workplaces, what good is it if there is no inclusion, right? So diversity only really counts when you go outside of your way, when you make sure to remove the different barriers so that people of diverse experience and background can join, can really play meaningful roles within the organization. I often like to say that conversations around anti-oppression and or anti-racism really need to be all encompassing, right? So sometimes, and this is my opinion, I think that it's much easier for us in this sector to talk about patriarchy, sexism, anything that is related to gender-based violence or gender-based oppression. We often shy away from conversations around why is it that we need diversity and inclusion in a women's sector to begin with, right? We often shy away from talking about colonialism. It's sad that in this day and age, there are people who don't know what colonialism is. And yet we live in a country that has been colonized, land that has been taken away from the first peoples of this land. And we want to talk about diversity. Well, there is diversity in a lot of diversity in terms of how we live, diversity in terms of our experiences. And Toronto is certainly very diverse. And the conversations need to encompass context for people, need to encompass where people coming from, what are their perspectives, because we often like to talk about the cultural pieces, the customs, but not diversity in thought, right? So I would like for us to be more open to looking at diversity in a more broader scope, right? So the work that we're doing, this, ARAO, as we say, anti-racist and anti-oppressive practice, it really requires us to, again, I'm gonna go back to what Hawa has said and what I said as well, that we have a very good understanding of our own social location and our positionality, that we check our biases so that we can inadvertently so that we don't inadvertently engage in behaviors that are oppressive. We need to have this critical lens when we are faced with a situation, when we engage in conversations around diversity. We need to be very careful about not fitting into the stereotypes, or not to have that narrow mind of what diversity is. And I know we only have an hour, so I need to check myself. Hawa, take it away.
Thank you, Carla. Yes, please, Hawa, I would love to know your perspective as well, since you're in Yellowknife and it's a very different scene compared to the rest of Canada. Yes, I would love to know what you think as well.
I totally echo a lot of what Carla was saying. When we look at diversity, it's broader than just race factor. We have to look at religion. We have to look at age. We have to look at socioeconomic status too of people. And I think in the North, especially like I live in Yellowknife. In Yellowknife, we have about 20,000 people. And most of our population are Indigenous. And we have a mixture of immigrants from different parts of the world, and we have Caucasian, and so we have a rich sense of diversity here. But I think in terms of really making sure that we're including people, I think anti-oppressive practice is about recognizing the differences that people have within the society, within our cultures, within our workplace culture, and trying to embrace that, trying to do things that include people. I think one of the stuff that I wanted to go back to when Carla was saying, we have to look at policies, we have to look at our employment policies, who are the people that we're hiring. I think one of the interesting thing about that is we do not only have to look at the policy and say, yes, we're meeting our quota in terms of we hire 2 Black people or we hire 2 Indigenous people, but it's about making sure that when those people come in, you give them equal opportunity, equal chances to succeed. Like, I know when you talk about equality, people think it's about sharing stuff into making sure everyone get the same amount, but this is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about looking at each person's situation, what they're coming in with, and giving them equal chance to be able to succeed in the workplace. So it's not just about bringing in minority. It's not just about saying we hire and we meet our quota, but what are we doing as employers, as people, as our community, to make sure that we're providing individuals with what they need in order to succeed. And it's about also bringing those people to the table and giving them positions where they can be able to have influence. It's not about hiring someone and say, oh, you'll be the housekeeper, and you have all the other race at the top of that person and just saying we've met this goal, right? So I think in the North, the conversation around anti-oppression is really different because, like I was saying, over half of our population are Indigenous. So we do recognize the history of colonization, residential school, intergenerational trauma. And we work a lot with that. We see a lot of that. And sometimes the conversation always come about competing interests. So one race is talking about what their interests are and what their needs are in terms of inclusion. And then you have other races, other cultures talking about that. But I think it's really about us coming together as one instead of competing against each other, working together to address what those differences are and what we need to see change. Because I think at the end of the day, fighting against each other or competing our interests against each other is not going to get us anywhere. So I think it's not about practicing those things differently, because at the end of the day, the issues are all similar, but it's about working together to address the same issues and the goals that we have, which is to achieve diversity and inclusion. Thank you.
Yeah, kind of as both of you were speaking, I was reflecting, and I as I went through like going about this webinar and just thinking in general about diversity inclusion and like anti-racism, anti-oppression, I always came back to the thought that like it's all the same fight at the end of the day. And also we're all victims of like colonialism and patriarchy at the end of the day. Like, does it affect us differently? 100%. And you need to recognize those differences. But especially working in this sector, like we're all obviously like anti-patriarchal and we fight for women, but it's the same fight, right? So I think that's really important to recognize that if you stand for one, you stand for all. And also for those who I know are coming from different places in Canada, and might be like more rural places as well, like that's something that you can take with you as well, that you might not have a lot of diversity in your shelter or serve a lot of diverse people, but at the end of the day, we all have a responsibility to like stand up for what's right and treat people correctly and educate ourselves as well. Yeah.
Great. If you don't mind me just, it's critical, it's really important that we recognize, right, that unless we address Canada's historical oppressive practice towards the first peoples of this land, unless we recognize we can't do any anti-oppressive work, unless we adopt their fight as our fight, we won't be able, as people of color, immigrants to this land, we won't be able to do it. I knew I was 17, 18 when I came to this country. I was always very politically aware. I knew that I was coming from a colonized country in Angola, who was colonized for 500 years, into another colonized country. So I knew that I was going to have to deal with oppression, because if the people of this land are oppressed, why would I assume that I would not be? So it's important for us to ensure that we recognize that if the people of this land are still not free, we won't be free. None of us will be free. So I just wanted to say that, because it's important for us. There's many people who come to Canada and know nothing about the history of Canada. That's unacceptable. That is unacceptable. Anyways, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to digress, but I think I just wanted to make sure that we hold this reality, this context when we're having these conversations and when we're trying to find strategic solutions.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like also like being a child of someone who's immigrated to Canada too, I relate to that as well. If you're going to come here, I think it's really important that you are an ally of the Indigenous people of this land and you support them. Yeah, for the exact reason that you said, if you're coming to a country that's already oppressing the people who are Indigenous to the land, what makes you think that that won't happen if you're coming here as an immigrant? Or if you're coming here, you're well. Anyway, I digress. I was going to go more into it. But.
No, and also that we have a level of privilege, right? And that it is just as important for us to recognize our privilege in whatever ways we have them, as it is to recognize the places of marginalization that we hold, right? Because this work requires that we do both, right? Today, we're maybe focusing more on race, but if we were to focus on other issues like gender, sexuality, we would all, well, at least I would be having to check myself, right? As a heterosexual woman, I would have to be checking myself and looking at my role in terms of addressing that oppression, right? And I guess we're gonna be moving on. I'm sorry, we only have an hour, right?
I know, but it's so important to talk about, and you're completely right. And who knows, there might be future webinars where we talk about it a little bit more. As we know, it's incredibly complex and important to discuss at the same time. So I can hop over into our next question. Over the past year, we have heard a lot about allyship and what the role of non-POCs is within the movement. What would effective allyship look like to you? And what would you suggest non-POCs on how they can avoid performative justice? And I'd love to point that over to Hawa.
I just want to echo what you guys were talking about. And it's interesting because the last few days I've been listening a lot to the news about the finding of the 215 children that were found in Kamloops. And it's going to be a long journey. And this just adds more, I want to say, more insults to already injury to Indigenous people across the country. And we know there is more that's going to come as they keep looking for, like looking through the schools. And it's just a shame for Canada to keep going through this, and for them to not to recognize the hurt and the pain, and really trying to like make real change, not just talking about, oh, we need to do this, we'll work on this. It's about now. What are we doing right now? We need to start with every long journey, start with the first step. The government needs to start taking that first step to acknowledge and start changing the system and things that need to change within the system. And it's like when you look at allyship, I've encountered situations where people act like as if they really understand what people are going through. And if you're facing oppression, you're facing discrimination at work, you're facing other forms of abuse at work, sometimes people come up to you acting as though they understand truly what you're going through. And no one can really understand unless you've been there. And even if you've been there, your experience is going to be different from the next person. And so it's really about being humble, being open to listening and learning from the people that are experiencing the pain, and seeing from their point of view what the issues are and what needs to change. It's not about, allyship is not about coming in and saying, oh yeah, I totally get what you're saying. I understand the pain. I can't imagine. Let me help you fight this fight. It's not about that. It's about meeting the people where they are, having those conversations, really getting a sense of what's going on for them, how they're feeling, and what they need to see change, and taking it from there, working alongside them, not going in front of them and saying you're going to change it, because we do recognize too, I know there's a lot of conversations around, if you have privilege, use it, but using it in a sense where you're working alongside the people that have experienced the pain and the hurt, and the people that want to see the change, and being that ally with them. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So I have for the past, I would say the past year or so, I have been really conflicted with the narrative around allyship. I think we need to flip. Let's flip things around. I think we need to be asking questions like, okay, so for instance, today we're focusing on anti-racism. So what is the standard that we want to achieve? If it's to become anti-racist, okay, the question then is, who needs to do the work? Who needs to do the work so that our workplaces, our communities, our society is no longer or are no longer racist? So if anti-racism is the goal, then who needs to do the work, right? Because I think that the current narrative around allyship kind of still has this kind of power dynamic where I will be your ally and help you to resolve this situation. But what's the problem? Who has the problem? If oppressive behavior is the problem, then let me help you to stop the racist behavior. If homophobia is the problem, then let those of us who are not gay then do the work, right? Conversations about racism do not need to happen only when people of color are around. You don't need permission to talk about racism. You can talk about racism. Solutions do require that people of color and racialized people participate, but it does not preclude you from having the conversations and for thinking very critically about what does it take to have a space, to have a organization, to have a society, to have an environment that is non-racist, right? What does it take, right? Do the work. It's about taking ownership of your own learning. It's about saying to yourself, you know what? It's not about saying, oh, I'm not racist. It's about saying, I want to practice anti-racism, right? Because we all have biases. We already talked about it in the beginning in terms of our values and beliefs and how they feed into ideology. So in terms of allyship, I really think we need to change the narrative. I think we need to be looking again at ourselves and asking the question, why is this issue important to me? Why is becoming anti-racist important to me? What benefits does it bring to me and to others, right? And then begin that work of recognizing how one's behavior, if it is racist, impacts not just the other person, but the workplace, the work you do, the services you provide. So allyship needs to be flipped upside down. I'm sorry, I need to make sure that this is, this is my opinion, right? It's one perspective. It is not, I'm not claiming to know it all. But what I'm saying is that there is a bit of comfort when you only consider yourself an ally, right? And I know as a person of color, I also need to recognize when I need to step back and say, hey, that's not my problem. I'm not racist. Let the people who have the problem do the work, and I'll be your ally. I'll be supporting your awareness building, your cultural attunement. I'll be doing the work to ensure that we all work in an environment that is non-oppressive. That's what I'm going to say about that.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's difficult. I think a narrative that has been put out there for being an ally is like, oh, let people of color like amplify their voices, which is so important to do. But at the same time, you're correct in that it puts the ownership to us. It puts the ball back in our court. And I think what definitely needs to be realized is that doing this type of work is incredibly emotionally taxing and can be re-traumatizing. And yeah, we need to figure out something different on how allyship works.
Yes, and I don't want it to be to do all the work. I don't want to have to be how do you say, to ensure that the different fragilities are not at play. I don't want to have to retell the story, and it's not an experiment. We all know, those of us who are people of color, racialized people, and those of us who are not, we all know what is wrong. We know the impact, right? This is why we've been talking about anti-oppression, anti-racism. This is why we've been wanting to put policies in place, training. If we know that there is a problem, what the problem is, then we need to locate ourselves within that. We locate ourselves within the problem, we locate ourselves within the solutions, and we work together, right? To ensure that racism is a thing of the past. And so us, people of color, also have to kind of step back a little bit. Non-Black folks, non-people of color shouldn't need permission to do anti-racist work, right? And again, this is me, Carla, right? This is my opinion, because I know that folks may not agree with what I'm saying, but I think that unless we change the narrative, we will continue to have the same problem, because there is no accountability, there is no ownership. If I need to ask for permission to do the work, then it's too hard. I'm just going to be a very passive ally, just making sure that I'm using my privilege to see. Again, nothing is changing. I still have the privilege, I still have the power, and it still feels like you're doing me a favor, right? So to me, I think I would invite you to think about it. You may not agree, but give it some thought. Yeah.
I think the one thing I wanted to point out when we look at people that are calling themselves supporters of when there is a shooting and they're putting up rallies and stuff like that for like George Floyd, and it's not just something that people think when something happened, we come out and support and be part of this process and be there to say, yes, we stand against racism. This is an ongoing work. It's not just something that you do when things happen. It's something that you have to keep doing on a daily basis, starting with yourself, starting with your children, starting with people around you. And when you see stuff, you call it out for what it is. And that's how we're going to start making change. And that's what's going to lead us to achieving bigger change. So it's not just about the one-time thing or going out when needed. It's about embedding these beliefs and this value into everyday life stuff that you do. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. And there was a question about like, what can we do beyond allyship? How do we move past it? But I think we answer it. There's so many things that we can do and a lot for everyone to reflect on. And also a reminder too, that there are like an insane amount of resources out there on the internet too, and books and all of that. So if you're really serious about this work and want to build your knowledge of what anti-racism looks like and anti-oppression looks like, there are so many resources on so many different platforms. So
And
I guess
none of these resources will mean much unless you really dig inside and ask yourself why this work is important to you. Why is it I have no Black friends? Why is it I aside from work, I don't know any other person of color? I mean, even that person of color thing, I mean, all these labels that we have, like that's for another webinar, but but I think really start with yourself. And sometimes I have to say, it's very painful, right? To be at a place where you feel like you know you're a nice person, you know you're a good person, and you cannot reconcile with the idea that you could possibly be doing things that hurts others. Let me tell you, we all do it. And I'm going to repeat, we're talking about race today, but if we were talking about any other issue, I'm sure that myself and Howard and Brit would be also needing to do that reflection. What I would like for us to do is to create the spaces where people are not afraid to say, you know what, damn, against all my, best intentions, I do think I have some biases that I need to take care of when it comes to race. Because you grew up in this society that has demonized Black people, for example. And these are things that stay in your subconscious, and you need to challenge those things. What are your beliefs about Black people, about people of color, about racialized people? What are your beliefs? And then challenge those, right? So that when you are working towards the eradication of racism, you're doing it in a genuine way. And people will see it when you're doing it genuinely. I think, oh my gosh, I think we still need to have questions from
I think this needs to be a 2-hour session.
I know it should have been, but yeah, I mean, it's a good start.
Yeah, but Hawa, did you have a response? Sorry.
Yeah, I think for me, the message that I want everyone listening to this today to take home, and from my experience, and I know many other people of color, many other immigrants, minorities are going through the same or slightly different experiences. Like everyone feel their experiences differently and they process them differently. But I think what I want people to take home is that this really hurts. It's a very painful experience for us to feel like we have to fight every day to prove that we're good people, to prove that we're deserving of respect and we're deserving of kindness. And I've been in so many situations where people just question you because of your appearance. Like people never really give you a chance. They question you, they judge you because of the color of your skin, what they see. And the one word that always comes back is you have an accent. And it's like people just always use these judgments. And I've had staff that I've worked with at the shelter where sometimes clients will call and say, I'm not talking to you, you have an accent. They want to talk to a white person they asked for. So it's like people need to recognize, I know we're all humans, I know we all feel, we all have feelings. So you need to recognize how painful that is for us, that we have to go through this every day just because of our skin color. Not because I've done anything wrong, but it's like it's a perception that people have. It's those beliefs that people have that Black people are like this or they're like that. Those are the beliefs that are hurtful, and those are the beliefs that leads to attitudes and behaviors that are hurtful. When I was in school, I was doing my master's, and I'm like, I have classmates coming to me and saying, why did you get an A+? And it's like, oh, okay. I guess I'm not supposed to get an A+ because I'm Black. Like they don't think that you deserve to get it because they start saying, well, English is not your first language. Well, you have an accent. Like, so I think the whole thing that I'm trying to say is that like people just feel like because of your color, because of your appearance, they can treat you and be disrespectful and just say whatever they feel like saying to you. And I just want people to know it really hurts. It's really hard to have these conversations. I know our generation have been having this conversation for years and years now, and I think enough is just enough, and we need to move past this. We don't need to be explaining ourselves. We don't need to be justifying of why we deserve better treatment. And that goes for all people of color, all minority, and all immigrants. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I'm sorry to push past your response and go into questioning, but you're right. Like, I guess I would define those as microaggressions, and they're very painful. And I think a lot of people don't realize what they're doing until it's too late. So it's important to examine your biases. And yeah, sorry, Carla, go ahead.
I just answered a question that was on the Q&A, and the person was talking about how, you know, folks really demonstrate that they want to do the work, but that the challenges arrive when policies are in place and things have to change, and then that's where the resistance comes. And I want to make sure that we know, that we all remember that this is hard work, right? And in doing this work, we need to always remain kind to ourselves and to others. We need to make space for people to be able to show their vulnerabilities, what they know, what they don't know, in a safe way, right? I think I always go for building awareness, education, before I bring down the law, right? I think that change is hard, even though change is the thing that we should be used to. But we have to recognize that change is hard. There's a lot of people thinking that they're losing their status. And in order for me to accept or to make space for others, I will lose something. This is the very narrative of scarcity, and that makes human beings fight human beings. Making space for somebody else does not take anything away from you. It doesn't change who you are, right? You're still going to be white or non-Black, right? I think that in the workplace, though, I would rather see genuine change than forced change. So that's why I always go back to be kind, make space for people to be able to share, especially things that they are not proud of, and then support them in implementing the change incrementally, right? Rather than, okay, this is the policy, because guess what? Okay, fine, I'll at work, I'll behave this way, but when I'm outside, I'm gonna go back to my old ways. And that's not really the change we wanna see, because we are all interconnected. Like, you're not only going to find racialized people at work, you're gonna find them in your neighborhoods, you're gonna find them in your places of worship, you're gonna find them in your communities, right? Unless you're the KKK, right? But if you're not, you're going to be living in places where there's racialized people. And so, yeah, I'm for being kind to the person and hard on the issue. And it's not because I'm going soft, right? It's because I think I'm at a place right now, maybe it's my age, I'm not sure, where I really believe that kindness and compassion and education and awareness can go a long way. Yeah.
Thank
Maybe it's the
you.
age.
I'll just say the question again for Hawa, if you wanted to give your response to. This person said, I'm finding that starting this work is not the challenge. Everyone is on board and motivated to fight racism internally and externally. But where things start to get tough is when we are changing policies and consistently holding people / ourselves accountable. This is when I'm seeing resistance to change show up in some really challenging ways. Any suggestions for continuing this work, or what to do when you hit these roadblocks?
I think the one suggestion I have is to keep going and not to just push it aside because people are not accepting, people are not wanting to do the work. Because as Carla was saying, it's a difficult work. Anything good does not come easy. It's going to take work, and that's the dedication that we need to see, that people actually care, and people actually care to try to make those changes, to work on themselves, to work with others. And it's interesting because I think with policies, people always think if it does not apply to me, that's fine. But it's like it applies to you and you actually need to do the work. So I think the one biggest thing is just to keep pushing and keep finding creative ways to bring those issues forward and to make the people that work within the organization realize that this is now an organization culture. It's not just something that you're saying for the time being and you get over it after a while, because maybe that's what they're thinking. It might go away if they don't respond, but they need to understand that this is changing times. It's an organization culture. It's something that everyone has embraced, and you need to work on that. So it's not, don't give up. Thank you.
Thank you.
There is a question from Sandra, sorry, about how do you manage the days when staff condones clients' racism towards other staff? And this is why I said in the beginning that this work has to be done across all levels of the organization, from your board members to your clients, to your donors, to your volunteers, your staff. And it needs to be incorporated into the program design. Addressing oppression should be part of the work you do with clients. And I remember back in the days when I was working frontline, a woman who, by the way, spoke Portuguese, which is the first language that I have, said, oh my gosh, I wanted to come so much earlier, but my husband kept saying that if I go to a shelter, I was going to be raped by Black people. And so she kept postponing until she couldn't take it anymore. And when she met me, and she's like, "You Black, but you're nice," right? And I felt so sorry for her, that she stayed in that abusive relationship for many reasons, but one of the most important reasons was the fear that going to a shelter would expose her to Black people. And of course, that woman left the shelter a changed person. So shelters are very special places because they give us the opportunity to have people who would otherwise not even interact with each other under one roof. And so we as staff, as EDs, as management, we have the responsibility to support growth and change. And that's by, again, having compassion and supporting the client with information and trying to draw the parallels between why the client is there receiving services. If it's a person that is fleeing violence, well, maybe make the comparison between violence against that person, maybe it's because of their gender, with violence against people of color, right? So really bringing in context and building empathy, right? And once you have done that, then the policies will be about enforcing. I don't like the word enforce, but will be about enforcing the commitments that the organization has made to anti-racism and anti-oppression. And unfortunately, sometimes people can change or won't change. And then you have to decide what kind of people you are willing to continue to engage with.
Yeah. So I'm just going to jump in, Carla, because we have one more question, and it's directed toward Hawa. So as an executive director, how do you bring issues of diversity and racism to your board members, and other than through training? How do you help them recognize their microaggressions and have them addressed?
Like, is this specific to board members or?
Yeah, so like as an ED, how do you, I guess, engage your board members when it comes to diversity and inclusion? But I guess they could also hold some biases. How do you engage with them?
I think for me, so I've been in this role since September of last year, but I've been with the Y for 9 years overall in different roles. And so I just started my work with the board a few months ago. So what I'm sensing is, I'm not really sensing any of microaggression directly yet. And, but my work with the board is really around bringing issues forward to them. So if there's issues within the staff or there are challenges, so if something like this was an issue, and just bringing that forward and seeing from their point of view, if they even see this as a problem. Because I think for me, that's where I will start. If I see it as a problem and I recognize this as a problem, I want to know if the board also does and if they have the same perspective as well too. Because like I was saying earlier, the board have a quota where they have to have so many people, but it's not just about that. It's about making sure that people really have good values, good beliefs that we want the organization to portray. So I've never really encountered a situation like that yet. But I think if I do, my course of action then is to call them out on that and have a conversation about that, because that's not the kind of organization I would want to work for. That's not the kind of people I want to work with, right? Thank you.
Absolutely, Howard. I mean, I think I've been a board member before. I'm still a board member in another organization. And the board is the place where it needs to start, because the board is responsible for the strategic direction of the organization, for the mandate, for the vision and mission. And the board needs to be, just like any other human being, thinking about their own values, beliefs, right? Board members are absolutely required to be able to think critically, right? Because the reflection of the board will go down all the way to service delivery, right? So it's absolutely important that the boards are informed, educated, diverse, because like I said before, it needs to be across the organization. So if your board is not diverse and you serving diverse populations, I will be asking why, right? Yeah. Oh my gosh, everything that is fun goes so quickly. Look,
I know.
3 o'clock.
Yeah, I unfortunately have to wrap everything up, but thank you both so much for your insight. You both are great and are so great of talking about this issue. So thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for everyone for joining us today. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please let us know. There's going to be a feedback survey sent out after this, along with the recording of this webinar. So please feel free to give your feedback there. And then I also want to thank the interpreters as well. I know that's hard work, so thank you so much for helping us up today with interpreting. And yeah, hopefully more webinars like this to come. We can kind of further this conversation there. Yeah, and again, thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Yes, you too, guys. Thank you so much.
Bye.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you so very much. Thank you. It was really a very interesting conversation, and we appreciate you creating the space for these conversations to happen. I think these conversations need to be happening more frequently. Thank you so much.
For sure. Thanks,
Okay.
everyone.
Yes.